Wonderful afternoon as we close out the 25th anniversary. Ladies and gentlemen, it is very seldom that one has the opportunity to introduce someone who is internationally effective in their field, in their discipline, and the conductor of the members of the Spokane Symphony this afternoon for Ragtime is truly internationally recognized. He is, as I introduced him on television this week, one of the Renaissance men, a composer, a conductor, an author, a great teacher, a philosopher, one of our own, we think, from the Northwest, the recently winner of the Pulitzer Prize. I introduce to you Gunther Schuller and members of the Spokane Symphony.
Thank you very Hello? Thank you very much. That was, of course, the famous Maple Leaf Rag, the piece by Scott Joplin that started the whole ragtime craze around the turn of the century. In the wake of the success of this one piece, the whole country went ragtime crazy, and for 15 years or so, into the time of World War I, ragtime was our popular music, the music we danced to, the music we were entertained by. Originally piano music, always written for the piano and written out almost like classical music, and not to be improvised, and to be played in a somewhat stately tempo, because there were two famous dances of the time that were associated with ragtime, the cakewalk and the slow drag, and they were of African origin. All the great ragtime composers were black composers, of course, and brought into this music something we call syncopation, which is nothing but sort of the vestiges of certain rhythmic ideas that you have in West African music. And ragtime reigned supreme for about 15, 20 years, gradually evolved, got more and more modern, more and more sophisticated, and eventually changed, was transformed into another style of music, related though, which around 1917 we began to call jazz. So ragtime is the forerunner of jazz. We'll have some examples of early jazz later on in the program. As I say, piano music, Scott Joplin was the great initiator, the great inventor of ragtime. He had quite a few rivals and contemporaries, as we'll see later on, for the piano. But the Maple Leaf Rag and other early pieces were such a success that people wanted to hear the music not just in honky-tonks and frankly, in bordellos and other such places where the piano professors used to play this music. They wanted to hear it in fine restaurants, in hotels, and of course very much in vaudeville theaters. So ragtime became the music of vaudeville during all those years, 1905, 1910, and so on. And that's how the orchestrations came into being. We don't know exactly when they were made or even by whom, but somewhere around maybe 1905, a collection of rags was printed. It was called, they had the nickname, the Redback Book of Rags. The actual title was 15 High-Class Sophisticated Ragtime Pieces. That was the actual title. And this is what we play here in absolutely authentic fashion. And the orchestrations, as you can see, were made for what you might call a mini symphony orchestra, because you have a string section, you have some woodwinds, and you have some brass, and then you have some rhythm instruments, which of course a symphony orchestra could also use sometimes. So we're going to play all this wonderful music for you this afternoon in the more or less authentic recreations from that early period, the turn of the century. That was the Maple Leaf Rag. We're going to continue with another rag by Scott Joplin. Not all rags were loud and fast, although many ragtime players indulge themselves and their whims in playing the music ridiculously fast. But Scott Joplin was such a master that he could write any kind of rag, you know, lyric ones, very boisterous and exciting ones, and very beautiful and elegant ones. This is an example of the latter. It's called the Pineapple Rag. Many of his pieces were named after growing things, fruits, trees, bushes, and so on. This is the Pineapple Rag, a lovely, softer, more lyric rag, featuring to some extent our string section. Scott Joplin's Pineapple Rag. I mentioned a little bit about the time when ragtime came in and its early beginnings. Well, even before it could be created by Scott Joplin, it had to grow out of some other tradition. And it's very interesting that ragtime, as Scott Joplin conceived it at first in the late 1890s, came out of a previously very well-established American tradition, namely the American March, as perfected by John Philip Sousa. There's one great similarity between March and ragtime, and that is that both forms, both kinds of pieces, have 4 themes and a particular sequence. And in the third theme, which we call the trio, is always in a new key, so it's a sort of refreshing moment at that point where it modulates to a new key. Very often the third theme is a little more sedate, a little quieter, and then it's contrasted with the fourth theme, which is usually an all-out, exuberant out chorus, as we sometimes call it. So 4 themes, and that meant, since all these were 32-bar song forms, you had to write 4 excellent themes in 32 bars with just the right harmonic progression. And if you consider that Joplin wrote 60 rags, plus, by the way, a wonderful opera called Treemonisha, that means 240 great themes. Who can write 240 themes, that you can whistle and hum and sing right away, more or less? That's really great achievement. Well, we want to illustrate a little bit the connection between ragtime and march by the next number, which is called the Sunflower Slow Drag. It's not so slow and it's not very draggy. It's just a good, nice dance number. And to point out the relationship to the march, we're going to give the strings a little rest and feature those instruments that you do hear in military bands or marching bands, namely piccolo, clarinet, trumpet, and trombone, plus the rhythm section. I don't know how the piano got in there, but we'll leave it in there anyway. And we'll play this rag first as a march, in a very militaristic or a very clipped kind of marching style. Then we're going to modulate to the next period, namely ragtime itself. And then finally, at the end, we're going to jazz it up a little bit because, as I mentioned, ragtime was transformed into jazz. Well, the kind of jazz that we now call Dixieland, but in the early days developed in New Orleans, and it was called collective jazz, polyphonic jazz. But now we call it Dixieland. So in these 2.5 minutes that this piece takes, you're not only going to be entertained, but you're going to be educated as to where ragtime came from, what it was, and where it went. Sunflower Slow Drag. 57 more Joplin rags to go. We haven't got time for all of those. I mentioned that he had rivals and contemporaries and so on. And I'd like to just present two pieces by two of the major rivals or contemporaries. James Scott, who was a good friend of Scott Joplin's, who wrote some 40 or 50 beautiful and very happy, very positive kinds of rags. And then another contemporary, a white ragtime composer, the greatest of the white ragtime composers, Joseph Lamb. Interesting story about Lamb. He came out to the Midwest, where all this happened, by the way, in Sedalia and in St. Louis. That was sort of the center of ragtime activity. He came out there to the Midwest to be around Scott Joplin, and wrote some wonderful rags early in his career. And then he moved back to his hometown, which happened to be Brooklyn. And he kept on composing rags all through his life. He died at a very advanced age in the 1960s. And what's curious about that is ragtime, went out, jazz came in, many forms of jazz, Dixieland jazz, swing, bebop, modern jazz, free jazz, and rock and roll came in, rhythm and blues, all these new musics. And it is as if Joseph Lamb never heard of any of them, because he sat in his little apartment and just kept writing rags all through the... And in fact, the rag we're going to play for you of Joseph Lamb was written in 1959. So it's very late, but it's in the pure Midwestern tradition. And we're going to play these sort of back-to-back. First we'll play the Joseph Lamb rag, which has a very curious title. I never met the gentleman. I never got a chance to ask him why he named this rag as he did. It's called the Bird Brain Rag. Maybe it was a comment on one of his friends or something. And then we'll follow that immediately with a James Scott rag, which is called, and this is typical of his music, Hilarity Rag. Joseph Lamb and James Scott. That was the first stereophonic duet in the history of music, the oboe and the violin. Incidentally, the original orchestrations were all for a 12-piece ensemble, as I mentioned, but as the music became more and more popular and some of the vaudeville theaters had larger pits and things like that, and the hotels had larger stages to play the dinner music, the orchestras grew, and they eventually took in all the fancy hoity-toity instruments from the symphony orchestra like oboe and bassoon, French horn, which of course didn't really exist in popular music of that time. And eventually they added second cornet and second clarinet, and they grew eventually, this is interesting historically, into what became the sort of standard 25-piece pit orchestra in the Broadway shows in the 1920s. And later on, you know, the major shows like not Old Man River, Showboat, and Oklahoma, and all those great shows, that all grew out of the ragtime orchestration way back at the turn of the century. Well, those were two of Scott Joplin's friends and rivals. He also had some wonderful pupils, because when he had this success with the Maple Leaf Rag in 1899, he got a 5-cent royalty on each sheet music that was sold. And it was almost a million seller, by the way, the first big seller of music in our country's history. And he became relatively wealthy, moved out of Sedalia to St. Louis, nearby, and opened up a teaching studio. And within weeks and months, all the young would-be ragtimers pilgrimaged to the Midwest to study with the great man, and if they couldn't, at least to walk in his shadow, as it were. And one of the earliest arrivals of this was a young man named Arthur Marshall, 17 years old at the time. And right away, under Joplin's tutelage, he wrote a fantastically skillful and exciting and infectiously bouncy rag, which is called Swipesy. We don't know what that means. So many of these titles are now obscure because the people who wrote them, you know, died, and no one ever bothered to ask them. But anyway, a wonderful rag. If you can sit still during this one, you are clinically dead. Arthur Marshall, as so many of these great musicians of the past are now long forgotten, unfortunately, but remember this name, Arthur Marshall, and think about it, a 17-year-old teenager writing this piece, maybe with a little help from Scott Joplin, but basically it's his piece, The Wonderful Swipesy by Arthur Marshall. 1, 2. So you can see the music began to swing after a while, which is, of course, that particular rhythmic element that makes jazz so exciting. Swing is the main rhythmic component of jazz music. And we're going to modulate now to two jazz pieces. This will be the two final pieces in the first half of our program. We'll take a short intermission after that. And there's no better way to move into early jazz than to celebrate the great genius and talent of one Jelly Roll Morton. Jelly Roll was one of the, well, he's the first great composer in jazz, wrote many of the standard tunes which for 20 years jazz musicians would improvise on. He was also a great pianist, really remarkable pianist, with technique to burn and a composer's imagination. Interesting career. He started out as a ragtime pianist in the red light district in New Orleans around 1902 or something like that, and got a little tired of that scene and began to wander through the whole southern United States as an itinerant pianist. And in those journeys, first he went east to Georgia and Alabama, and then he traveled west back through New Orleans out into Texas, and finally ended up around 1910 in Los Angeles, where for 10 years he reigned supreme as the major jazz musician there. This was when jazz was then coming in really big. And during those travels, evidently he picked up on all the different southern black musics that were being played, not recorded, but just played in the towns, in the villages, and in the fields. Music like the blues, music like the street songs, the field hollers, the work songs, the children's songs, and of course mixed in with ragtime, his music. And Jelly Roll Morton was also an avid visitor of the famous French Opera House in New Orleans, where he heard pieces like Traviata and Trovatore, so he also picked up on the classical music. Well, evidently, we have no recordings of this. Jelly Roll didn't really record until 1923. But during those teens, the 19-teens, he evidently put together all these musical strands of black music, and out came, I often call it a bouillabaisse, a wonderful bouillabaisse. Out came this music, which later came to be called jazz. Jelly Roll Morton picked up on that, and he was quite a braggart, and he claimed that he had invented jazz. Well, no one invents jazz, it sort of accumulates, but he had a card printed up which said, Jelly Roll Ferdinand Lamont, he was a French Creole, Lamont Morton, and it said, inventor of jazz. And then he said underneath, like Edison. And he got into a lot of trouble for that. But anyway, he was a truly great musician, now pretty much forgotten. Jazz musicians still celebrate him. But he wrote many wonderful pieces and made fine recordings in the mid-20s, and we're going to recreate two of those for you right now. They were made in 1926 with a little band of 7 players, only 7 players, that he put together. They called themselves the Red Hot Peppers. You had to have snappy names in those days, not the Spokane Symphony, But they never played in public. They never played in any of the famous South Side clubs where Louis Armstrong and Earl Hines were playing. They just played in the recording studios, and in a period of about 3 or 4 weeks made some of the greatest classic recordings of what we now call the golden age of jazz, along with Louis Armstrong and Bessie Smith and Coleman Hawkins and those players. The Red Hot Peppers, these were mostly Jelly Roll's own tunes, and or arrangements, and he had the audacity to ask his musicians to rehearse. No one rehearsed in those days. You just got up and played, good or bad. But he insisted, because he was a composer, he insisted on things being right, and he rehearsed these musicians very thoroughly. They were all colleagues of his, friends of his from the old days in New Orleans, and were very familiar with the classic New Orleans polyphonic improvisational style, as you will hear. We're not going to improvise. We're recreating the solos as they were played by those musicians in 1926. The first piece is called the Smokehouse Blues, which is one of those real low-down, dirty blues. Actually, it's not a blues at all in terms of the harmonic changes, but it's a blues type of piece. And then we'll finish the half of the program with a piece by Jello Roll Morton called The Grandpa's Spells, like spells, voodoo spells or something. Again, we don't know why it's called that. One slow number, one very lively, fast number that was originally a ragtime piece by Morton, but here he arranged it as a kind of jazz piece with improvisation. The thing you should note is that in those days, jazz recordings were relegated to 3 minutes or less, because that's what a 10-inch disc running at 78 revolutions per minute could hold. So you couldn't go beyond 3 minutes. And that meant that these great masters, Armstrong, Ellington, Jelly Roll Morton, had to create little miniature masterpieces and say everything they wanted to say in 3 minutes. Now they can take 45 minutes, and sometimes they don't say very much. So I want you to appreciate how Jelly Roll Morton maximizes the use of these 7 musicians, 3 horns, as we now call them. The frontline instruments in the New Orleans classic jazz, which we now call Dixieland, is a clarinet and a trumpet and trombone. The other instruments are rhythm instruments, and by the way, we're going to have adding now a banjo and a guitar. And they play, the 3 instruments, of course, play the melodic material, and then the 4-piece rhythm. But it's interesting to see how in these short time spans, 2.5 minutes, 3 minutes, everyone gets a little lick in. Everyone gets to play a significant contribution to the performance. These are marvelous pieces. Jelly Roll Morton's Smokehouse Blues and Grandpa's Spells. first half of the program, most of those were from the early first decade of ragtime. Ragtime, like any good music, advances. It becomes more and more explorative in the hands of the great composers. It becomes more and more adventurous, more sophisticated. And the second half of the program, we're going to feature some of the later ragtime pieces and, again, on into jazz. The first piece is called Pastime Rag, and it was written by Artie Matthews. Artie Matthews was one of the great ragtimers, and also famous in jazz legends as the writer of the Weary Blues from 1915, which became one of the most popular jazz standards of the early years. Artie Matthews later in 1920 abandoned ragtime. He suddenly was converted to some kind of a notion that this was an evil music, which was shared, by the way, the opinion was shared by many, many people. I should tell you that in the early days of ragtime, in some of the ladies' journals, magazines, you could read articles by authors who would advise parents not to let their children get near ragtime because they'd get pimples in their face. While ragtime was very popular and very much supported, again, by the aforementioned John Philip Sousa, by the way, it had a lot of enemies, as all new musics usually do. And so by 1921, Artie Matthews had this conversion away from ragtime. He gave it up completely and started a classical music school in Cincinnati. And he flourished there with this conservatory of his until well into the 1940s. It's funny, I played horn in Cincinnati in 1943 through 1945, and I was not aware that Artie Matthews was there teaching. I would have loved to have met him. Anyway, in 1913, he began a series of rags called Pastime Rags, and he just numbered them 1 through 5. And they are amongst some of the most splendid and most inventive ragtime pieces, however, rather modern and at times a little complicated. So in those days, they were not much of a success. He was pretty much rejected as someone who was far too far out for ragtime. Now, this music, of course, sounds very pleasant to our ears. The rag that we're going to play for you, I orchestrated this from the piano sheet music, Pastime Rag number 4, features a very, still somewhat modern touch. It's a thing we call in music a cluster, which simply means that when you play on the piano, you play very close positioned notes rather than widely spread. Yeah, right, exactly. And the first strain of this rag features such a cluster solo. Now that's pretty adventurous because now the cluster in contemporary music has become almost a cliche. Every composer uses it right and left, and it's worn out its welcome, I think, anyway. But in 1913, this must have been a real shock to people at that time because it sounds sort of dissonant. But it's such a beautiful and sophisticated rag. You're really going to love this. Artie Matthews, Pastime Rag number 4. those rags, those 5 were written, as I say, starting in 1913. The last one was written around 1920, when the ragtime era was almost over and jazz was in. At around that very same time, a new ragtime composer came in, very big, quite suddenly. His name was Zez Confrey. Anybody remember that name? Yeah. He wrote 2 incredible pieces with which he became overnight a millionaire, namely Dizzy Fingers and Kitten on the Keys. And how he became a millionaire is very interesting, because these are piano pieces. They used to call them novelty pieces. They sort of gave up on the name ragtime. Novelty piano pieces. And they are both very fast pieces. And you have to be a Vladimir Horowitz. You have to be a virtuoso to play these pieces. Well, in those days, you know, before television and even mostly before radio, you know, you had a living room, you had a parlor, and you always had an upright piano in the parlor. Well, you had to put something on that piano, right? Usually there was the John Thompson piano method, the red book. You remember that one? That was always there. But you had to have something more than a study book. So thousands and thousands of people bought Dizzy Fingers. Why? Because it's an incredible title. Beethoven never used that title, you know. And so they all bought this music, and of course the stores loved selling it. And then when they'd get home, they tried to play it, and of course it was all over play once. You know do you know what yeah, it's one of those, you know. You try that on your parlor piano, you know. And Zez Confrey, who then went on to write many more wonderful pieces, all very catchy tunes, as I say, became very wealthy through this fluke that he wrote music that nobody could play. When I started this ragtime ensemble 21 years ago, I arranged Dizzy Fingers for this ensemble, for the full ensemble, and you'll hear it now. Now the Dizzy Fingers of the piano are now over in the clarinet. Dizzy Fingers, Zez Confrey. have no idea how hard all these pieces are. They may sound easy. Well, next, moving right along, we move to a wonderful ragtime composer, a gentleman I had the great honor and pleasure and privilege to meet late in his life. This is the famous Eubie Blake. In 1917, Eubie Blake wrote a piece for himself, one of these ragtime show-off exhibitionistic pieces. He called it, however, Sounds of Africa. And he made a recording in 1920, I think, of this piece. It wasn't much of a success, but it's a great piece. And then Eubie was very, very shrewd. Some of you must have heard him on the Johnny Carson show, for example, where very often he even outwitted the master. You know, he had a tremendous sense of humor, very quick on his feet. And so he was also in the Charleston age, which came in 1923 when the Charleston became the big dance. Eubie Blake took this piece, Sounds of Africa, and renamed it the Charleston Rag. And he got a whole new mileage out of this piece, you know. And of course, Eubie went on to some fame. He created the first all-black Broadway show, Shuffle Along. But mostly during those years when ragtime was a dead music and supplanted by jazz, you know, he had a rough time making a living because his kind of music was just forgotten and neglected. But he was smart enough to live very long to see the revival of ragtime come around, which happened in the 1970s. And when I met him, I orchestrated this Charleston Rag, and we premiered it in Carnegie Hall, and we invited him, and he sat in the center box up there. And it was a wonderful occasion for us, but also for him. And he said after the concert, he said, Dr. Schuller, he always called me doctor, you know, I didn't cry when my mother died, and I didn't cry when my father died, but I cried tonight when you played my Charleston Rag. It was very, very touching. It's a fantastic virtuoso piece, almost unplayable on the piano, which has a sort of reverse boogie-woogie bass line long before boogie-woogie music came in. And it's also a brilliant virtuoso piece for this ensemble. Eubie Blake's great Charleston Rag. By the way, Eubie Blake, at that time, he said, Dr. Schuller, you know, I'm going to live to be 100 years. And I said, well, you know, that's something to claim. Well, he did. He lived 100 years in 5 days. You know? So anyway, Eubie Blake's Charleston Rag. all the really famous and remembered great ragtime music is from the early part of the century. And as I've mentioned several times, ragtime went out of business, and therefore also no one except Joseph Lamb, sitting in his Brooklyn apartment, wrote any more rags until the late 60s, when two young composers in Michigan University, Bill Bolcom and William Albright, started to write rags, but in a very modern style, not in the classic Midwestern or St. Louis style. And still, ragtime music didn't really catch on until this revival, which I had something to do with, by the way, in 1973, 74. And at that point, I started looking for modern or recently composed rags, and I was sent, because I became sort of famous with this ragtime business, I was sent all kinds of music, most of it just awful garbage that I just would not foist on any public. But then something extraordinary happened when our ensemble was about, in his 7th or 8th year. My tuba player, his name is Rob Carricker, who had been a student with me at the New England Conservatory, he got up and wrote a rag for a brass quintet to which he belonged. And he showed it to me. He also had a piano version of it. And I was so taken with this piece because it was not only in the pure classic Midwestern ragtime style, but it had a few modern touches, harmonic and melodic and even structural, that Scott Joplin could never have done. So it was the best of both worlds. It sort of moved a little bit more into the later 20th century, but still stayed true to the classic tradition. He lives in a suburb of Boston. It's called Mattapan. And so, not able to think of anything better, he named it after his hometown. So it's called the Mattapan Rag. And because he's a tuba player, I orchestrated this piece for him, for the ensemble. I felt I had to give him a little tuba solo. The tuba does not solo in ragtime usually. It just plays the of the pa, you know. So now you're going to have the extraordinary experience of hearing a teensy-weensy little tuba solo in the midst of all this. All kidding aside, an absolutely fantastic piece. We've played it in my ensemble on every concert. It's always a wonderful success. You'll be amazed at this, what a fine piece this is. Rob Carricker's Mattapan Rag. 1, 2. That was the first of the good rags that I received one way or another. The next one is a wonderful piece written by someone whom you all know quite well. When I was still at Tanglewood, before I came to Sandpoint, as artistic director at Sandpoint, we had a conducting program. And amongst many other people who came there to study conducting, there was a young man named Stefan Kosinski. And I was quite amazed and very pleased when one day, halfway through the program, he handed me a ragtime piece. And I thought, boy, that's pretty unusual, a classical conductor writing ragtime music. Well, it's a wonderful piece, and we've played it quite often. And it was written in honor of the mayor of his hometown, Wilmington, Delaware, Mr. Maloney. So it's called the Maloney Rag. It is again like Rob Carricker's piece, a little bit modern. It has certain touches, changes of tempo, for example, and some sort of jazzy, bluesish things in it that perhaps Scott Joplin would not have written. It also has a couple of surprises in it. I won't give those away. They're musical surprises, and altogether a very fetching and exciting rag, starting a sort of new ragtime tradition. So we'd like to play for your pleasure now Stefan Kosinski's wonderful Maloney Rag. you know, getting so much bad music, receiving so much bad ragtime music, and only very few good pieces. I myself have been involved with ragtime since my teen years. I was very hesitant about writing a piece. And for many years I didn't. Till finally, this is sort of local history, Larry Jess's brass quintet, or brass sextet, asked me to write a rag for them. Every brass quintet now has rags in their repertory. And so I did, and then in the version for this mini symphony orchestra, we premiered it at Sandpoint, at my festival up in Sandpoint, and therefore, like Mr. Carricker naming his rag after his hometown, I named this the Sandpoint Rag. And so Idaho gets into this. What's also the first time in this piece is a French horn solo. Now, you all know I used to play the French horn. French horn, by the way, plays the pa that the tuba plays the And it gets kind of boring after a while, particularly in marches when we just have to play pa, 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 pa. Anyway, I thought I have to write a French horn solo, so I did, and you'll hear one of the, maybe the only French horn solo yet in ragtime music. My Sandpoint Rag, for your pleasure. 1, 2. we should return once more to that great music known as jazz. And we're going to play another Jelly Roll Morton piece for you. This is from the same recording sessions of 1926 for the RCA Victor Company, the Red Hot Peppers Band. And this one is named after the then 1926 great dance craze. It was called the Black Bottom. And so this is called the Black Bottom Stomp. Jelly Roll Morton. Wow. We have one more piece for you, then unfortunately we've got to go. And this is by, again, alas, a very much forgotten great musician of the time of World War I. His name is James Reese Europe, spelled just like the continent Europe. Had a fantastic career as someone involved with dance music and early jazz who revolutionized dancing and jazz music, early jazz music around the time of World War I. He did many spectacular things, including founding the first black musicians union in New York, and then building an orchestra of 150 black musicians and invading Carnegie Hall, which was this sacred precinct, you know, where no blacks had ever been allowed. And he came with this 150-piece orchestra and played classical overtures, played some ragtime, played some early jazz, and some sort of African-oriented dance music. Quite a spectacular concert. Turned New York on its ear. Everybody was talking about James Europe. Around 1915, a great dance team, Irene and Vernon Castle, came to New York. They were from England, at least he was, and they are sort of responsible for the major dance crazes that hit us in the early years of this century. The Castles invented 30 to 40 different dances, the most lasting of which is the foxtrot. And so they needed a musician, a music director, to write the music for all these new dances. Every month they came out with a new dance. And they hired James Europe, and he wrote most of the music for them. They traveled all through the United States. For all I know, they might have been, maybe not in Coeur d'Alene, but in Spokane, and became very nationally famous. And Europe kept turning out all this new music for them. And then came, of course, we entered the war, World War I, and James Europe was hired to put together a black regiment, a black band, military band. And he did so. He got the finest musicians together that he could, and incidentally had to import oboe players and French horn players from South Africa, because there weren't any in the United States at that time. And that band was called the Hellfighters Band of the 365th Regiment, became so famous in France, both for the doughboys, the American soldiers, but also the French population, that they almost wanted to elect James Europe Prime Minister of France. And also the American generals got wind of the success of this music, which was, by the way, a kind of embryonic, very early jazz. Because what these musicians did, they took the Sousa marches and jazzed them up. And you had the whole trombone sections playing sort of wild breaks in the middle of these marches, or the entire clarinet section. Well, anyway, the generals got a hold of this, and General Pershing did too, and he invited James Europe and his band to the signing of the armistice in 1918. Following which, he came back to the United States after making some recordings in Paris, and was given, as the only time that a musician was ever given a ticker parade on Fifth Avenue in New York. That happened in 1919. And then he started to, he thought about forming an orchestra and traveling around the United States, a big orchestra. And then, unfortunately, one night in Boston, his drummer, Herbert Wright, and he got into an argument, and Herbert Wright knifed him in the neck. And because he would not be taken to a white hospital, he bled to death during the night. And so that was a tragic end to what it would have been continued to be a brilliant career. He could have been another Paul Whiteman or something like that. Anyway, a great man, alas, very much forgotten. I've told you a little story about him because we should remember him, because he, as I say, revolutionized and galvanized our dance music in very specific ways, including speeding up the tempo. Dances in ragtime were relatively stately, but by the time James Europe got a hold of these, they were going at a murderous tempo. And speaking of murderous, there is in the piece we're going to play for you, which is called the Castle House Rag, named after the castles. There is on the recording, which I transcribed from the 1914 recording, a murderously difficult drum solo. Murder having nothing to do with drummers, though, you know. Anyway, we're going to recreate this fantastic recording for you from 1914. This will be our final number, and it'll certainly be a fitting climax to this wonderful concert of ragtime. You've been a marvelous audience, and we've enjoyed working for you, not only for you, but also in this wonderful auditorium. Boy, are you lucky to have a place like this. The acoustics, everything about it is really terrific. And I must do this before we finish the concert. I want the second violin, Jane Blake, and Claire Keeble to stand up because they played nothing but afterbeats all afternoon. Okay, Castle House Rag, James Reese Europe. See you all. unfortunately, we have to close this concert because these fine musicians, I love working with them, have a rehearsal in Spokane starting in 10 minutes. They're not going to make it. But so we must say goodbye to you. Thank you again for your wonderful attendance. Thank you.